Good afternoon, everybody. This is Debbie Rauscher with John Burton Advocates for Youth. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Accelerating Success, Turning Insights into Action for Foster Youth at California Community Colleges. I am very excited today to welcome our two presenters. So I will be moderating the webinar, but our two primary presenters are from Educational Results Partnership, one of our partner organizations in the California College Pathways Project, and we're extremely excited to have both of them with us today. So we have April Allen and Elliot Rice, who are both with ERP and were the primary authors and analyzers of data for the report that we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Next slide. So before we jump into the actual content for today's webinar, I wanted to just share a little bit of logistical information. Most of you are probably listening in through your computers, which is fine. If for some reason, however, you have any problems with your audio, you can select on your control panel the button that says telephone, and you can call in using the number listed there on your screen. If you have questions during the presentation, there is a questions box on your control panel where you can type in your questions. If you have technical questions or there's something going on with the technology, I will go ahead and try to respond to you right away. If you have content-related questions, we'll be collecting all of the questions, and April and Elliot will be answering the questions at the end of the session today. But feel free to go ahead and send in your questions throughout the webinar. We'll be collecting them throughout the presentation and then addressing them at the end. The PowerPoint today can be downloaded from the handout section of your control panel. So this is actually something new we're trying. For those of you who have been on our webinars before, you might not have seen this. On the control panel, there should be a place that says handouts. And we have there the handout with a PDF of all the slides. Some of you in the past have asked to be able to print out the presentation so you can follow along and take notes while the presenters are talking. So we've gone ahead and created a handout with all the slides, so you should feel free to just download that straight from the control panel and print it out or save it for future reference. We also will be posting the PowerPoint along with a recording of this web seminar on both the John Burton Advocates for Youth website and the California College Pathways website. So if you have other folks who want to listen later, that opportunity will be available to them. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to April.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you all for joining. We are so excited to be able to share some of this work. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge all of those that made this report and the findings that we're sharing possible. So first, funding and expertise was provided by John Burton Advocates for Youth, in particular Debbie, the Stewart Foundation and Alexia Everett, and the May and Stanley Smith Charitable Trust and Elizabeth Cutler. Those individuals that I named gave a huge amount of feedback onto the report, and it is so much better for their contributions. I also want to thank the Marklead Foundation, the Walter S. Johnson Foundation, and the Pritzker Foster Care Initiative for funding both this report and or the system of data that underlies the foster care and foster youth research that we do. I also want to recognize Mark Courtney of Chapin Hall and Nate Opkitch from the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. They provided feedback on our study design and interpretation of results. And we'd also like to acknowledge the funding and support that the California Community College Chancellor's Office provided for CalPass Plus, which is a system of data that is produced in partnership by EdResults and the San Joaquin Delta College. And finally, just a thank you to all the EdResults staff who contributed to this report. While Elliot and I are here and sharing this work, there were so many people that made it possible. And then in addition, throughout this presentation and in the report that we'll have a link to at the end of the presentation, we named 6 Bright Spot colleges, and we'll explain a little bit more about who these colleges are and what they contributed, but these colleges participated in interviews, and we really thank them for their time and expertise. So I want us to get started just as a brief orientation to California College Pathways and how we've been thinking about foster youth post-secondary success in particular. So in the early 2000s, the Guardian Scholars Program was initiated at community colleges across California. By 2006, the Chancellor's Office launched the Foster Youth Success Initiative, which identified foster youth liaisons at each community college. Kind of fast forward to a little bit more towards present day, and in 2014, SB 1023 created CAFES funding, which supports foster youth programming and other supports, and it's currently in place at 10 community college districts, total of 26 colleges under the Next Up program. So we also wanted to situate the work that this report, Accelerating Success, has done in terms of previous work, particularly through College Pathways. So in 2015, the Charting the Course report was released, which was a groundbreaking first step to understanding the educational pathways and trends for foster youth. The findings represented about 20 California College Pathways campuses and pointed to areas of strength as well as need for further research and attention to understand how colleges and universities were accomplishing the 4 E's. So equipping foster youth with essential resources to succeed, enrolling foster youth in post-secondary education, helping foster youth earn a degree or certificate, and then allowing foster youth to embark on a career. So the Accelerating Success report and the research that underlies it builds on the foundation established by Charting the Course. We provide updated descriptive outcomes reflecting more updated data 2 years after the initial report, using some of the same metrics so we can see how things have changed over time and also with all 114 community colleges. We also provided a deeper analysis using several advanced statistical methods to pinpoint milestones and momentum points for student success. We analyzed specific program practices and institutional factors and tied those back to student success, and then also did a qualitative investigation and description of promising practices identified at some bright spot colleges. So briefly, I'll touch on the methodology. If you have detailed questions, there is a methodology page in the full report, as well as a pretty technical appendix at the end that briefly covers some of the results. But the quantitative data that we're using is from the CalPath Plus system of data that I referenced before, which is that cooperative partnership between EdResults and San Joaquin Delta College. We also did a survey of institutional policies and foster youth programs at all community colleges and had 69 respond. We did a multi-method analysis that used quantitative data to identify colleges that had better than expected outcomes for foster youth. And we called these our bright spots. And then we incorporated qualitative interviews to uncover some of the promising practices at those schools. So I want to turn to the first of the 4 E's, equip. So thinking about how schools, how colleges are preparing students and equipping them with the resources or knowledge that they need to succeed in post-secondary education. As a first step, we wanted to uncover some of the foster youth demographics. As I mentioned, Charting the Course had a sample of information, but we, for the first time now, have all of the foster youth who are identified across these community colleges. In the most recent year of data that we had, which was 2015 to 2016, there were about 23,500 identified foster youth in total. Our report focused on first-time college students that had been flagged in the system as foster youth by their particular college. So this smaller cohort gives us a smaller population, but they have characteristics in common that we wanted to follow through for some of our analyses. We noted that the sample of foster youth was more female than male, 54% female, whereas non-foster youth had more gender parity. An interesting thing we noted was that in terms of race, African American foster youth, while being generally underrepresented across many academic outcomes that we would like to see, were actually overrepresented in the population of foster youth. They were a greater percentage of the foster youth community college student population So almost 18% compared to 7% of the general population and about 6% of non-foster youth. We think that has, probably a lot to do with disproportionality in the foster care system as a whole and who is coming in the front door. But it was an interesting finding that we also want to tie back to some of the outcomes downstream for this population for African American foster youth. Conversely, we noticed that Asian foster youth were actually underrepresented as a percentage of the population compared to their population in California. So one of the key markers that we looked at was in terms of student preparation. So are foster youth students arriving at community college prepared to succeed? One marker of that, although there are many, is looking at students who begin their community college career in remedial coursework. What we're showing here is that foster youth are more likely to enroll in remedial math, English, or English as second language courses rather than transfer level courses compared to their non-foster youth peers. So almost 90% of foster youth who enrolled in math or English courses were in remedial math. And then similarly, 75% of foster youth were in remedial English courses compared to 62% of foster youth. We wanted to pull in some of the qualitative findings here to identify some of the ways that Bright Spot colleges were preparing foster youth. And one of the key markers that was identified in charting the course and a lot of other research is that foster youth often have substantial financial barriers to accessing college and then being able to remain in college with the resources that they need. Across several of the Bright Spot colleges, we identified staff that went above and beyond to assist students with paperwork or questions regarding financial aid. At Evergreen Valley College, foster youth program staff would accompany foster youth students to the financial aid office and then sit with them as questions were asked. In terms of other concrete supports, Reedley College provides on-campus housing, which was a concern that we heard across the survey of foster youth programs that we did. And so in this case, having that resource available for on-campus housing, going a step further in terms of having foster youth have priority status was also raised as something that allowed foster youth, equipped foster youth with the resources they needed. Similarly, Fresno City College, while they don't have on-campus housing, was finding interesting or innovative ways to collaborate with community partners to support foster youth. So having a warm handoff and a front door, which I know many other programs and colleges might do, but also identifying ways that foster youth who are placed in emergency housing in a motel might not have to guarantee a room with a credit card, which they may not have. So these were just an illustration of examples. We know that these promising practices may exist at other schools, but we're hopeful to see how widespread they are as we go forward. We're also interested in the ways that colleges are equipping faculty and staff to support foster youth once they arrive at the community college. While foster youth are not identified to faculty, there are some general things that the Bright Spot colleges called out as being supportive of foster youth student success. So that includes providing training for faculty so they understand the needs of foster youth and other vulnerable populations. College of the Canyons in particular offers a cohort model where a cohort of faculty will complete up to 54 hours of training and upon completion of that training receive a 10% pay bump. Now, this is not directed only to foster youth in terms of the population of interest in these trainings, but it supports a general approach to equipping faculty to understand the needs of students. Other things that we noted were general training on trauma and behavioral integration and integration of social and emotional learning in the classroom. And generally, we found that Bright Spot colleges shared that informing instructors about the needs of foster youth was found to enhance academic experiences and educational success for foster youth. So moving on to enroll, we wanted to focus on the descriptive statistics in terms of what does it look like once foster youth come in the door, and then predict what, more importantly to us, predict how we can support foster youth in achieving positive outcomes. So this section's a little heavier on the descriptive side, and when I turn it over to Elliot later, we are going to talk in depth about some of the predictive ways that we can support foster youth success. So the first category that we looked at was course attempts by foster youth status. And you'll see in this table credit attempts for 6+, 12+, and 15+ credits. These categories are not exclusive, so foster youth who show up in the 6+ credit realm are also going to, in the 12+ credit realm are also going to show up in the 6+ credit. However, we noticed across all of these categories that foster youth on average attempt fewer credits at all levels than non-foster youth. We know that there's been a great deal of discussion in the field about the best way to support foster youth and to ensure that you're not overwhelming foster youth with a great deal of coursework so that you can help foster youth persist. In terms of the trends that we saw, that is borne out, that most foster youth are attempting fewer courses, especially at one level. This excludes remedial coursework, except for math courses one level below transfer. So we do know that there's a conversation to be had around foster youth course attempts and the ideal course load, if there is one. But a lot of research has shown that attempting 15+ credits, which is that 8% in the far right of our chart, it's not only rare for foster youth, but it is also tied to a substantial body of research that has shown that foster youth, that other students who attempt 15+ credits in the first term and complete 30+ credits in the first year are more likely to achieve a credential. So that conversation is going to continue through the course of our presentation, but also, I'm sure, going forward. It's not shown on the slide, but we found that foster youth also had almost comparable proportions of students who attend full-time, slightly less, so 32% of foster youth were full-time compared to 36% of non-foster youth. However, that we do know now that more foster youth are going to be in remedial courses. In terms of term-to-term persistence, we noted that foster youth were less likely to persist term-to-term. And unlike the previous course attempt piece where there was very little race and ethnicity differences, here we noticed that African American students and multiracial students were less likely to persist term-to-term. Asian foster youth students persist at higher rates than other ethnic groups, but still lower than non-foster youth, which is about 67%. So what you're seeing on the screen now is the decision tree, and it was a type of advanced analysis that our team has done to identify the optimal pathways to student success. We used a cohort of students from 2012 to 2013. In using this older cohort, it helped us to be able to follow students for a greater period of time forward to see if they were persisting. We found that the overall foster youth were 49% of the cohort that we looked at were likely to persist term to term. And then when the two most important variables that you'll see in the bright orange were foster youth with a standard diploma and then declaring an educational goal. So I'll start with a standard diploma. So a standard diploma instead of a GED or not getting a diploma at all. So for foster youth that did have a standard diploma, their likelihood of persisting increased from 49% to 56%. For foster youth without a standard diploma, their likelihood of persisting dropped from 49% to 40%. But if they declared a goal, an educational goal, in this case in CCC Apply, having a goal of a degree, a certificate, or a transfer, their likelihood of persisting, even if without a standard diploma, increased to 47%, compared to foster youth without a diploma and without declaring that goal, which was 34%. So without changing the learner, we've identified a best alternative path forward. And this is the kind of actionable information that we're hoping to share with individuals working with foster youth in the colleges and in high schools, because if a foster youth student is coming in high school and making the decision to drop out or making the decision to defer some of their education, we would like this information to be front and center, that it's not just affecting the high school outcomes, but also may be supportive of future success in college. Digging back a little bit more into the persistence with social supports, our qualitative work identified various ways that Bright Spot colleges were trying to have uninterrupted contact with foster youth. Reedley College, for example, uses the Remind app to keep in contact. Some of its text messages about workshops, deadlines, or just to remain in touch. And using the app allows foster youth to text directly to a foster youth program person and have the foster youth program person receive it as an email that they can then reply to, rather than having, you know, personal and work emails coming in, work text messages coming in on their phones. The college support people at Reedley also identified that the foster youth were not responding to emails, and so this was not only good for reaching out to students, but was also their preferred method of communication. We also focused on various ways that mental health counseling, peer support groups, and life skills workshops were raised as beneficial by the Bright Spot colleges. Again, this is not to say that many other colleges do not provide these services, but what we identified from the survey and the descriptions were that some of the Bright Spot colleges had a greater intensity or availability of services. So I want to turn this over to Elliot, and he will share a little bit more about the earning side of the 4Es.
Thank you, April. So April highlighted equipped and enrolled. So now we're going to turn to earning. So we're going to be looking at the unit completion and as well as community college completion in total. So this first slide here is we're going to be looking at credits earned. So figure 6 there is the number of credits earned in the first term. We can see, and once again, these categories are not exclusive. So students who earn 12 units, again, will be in that 6-unit bucket. So you can see across the board there, non-foster youth students earn higher units than foster youth students. On figure 7, this is just looking at foster youth students who are earning 15 credits in their first term, and is broken down by race. Now, while only 1% of foster youth students actually earn 15 units in their first term, we report it here because of its predictive power later on, looking at how students complete community college. So you can see here 2.6% of Asian students complete that 15 units in their first term, compared to 0.3% of African American students. And as April pointed out earlier, the foster youth population in the community college system is about 20% African American and about 5% Asian. So you can see the disparities within the foster youth population. Next slide. So now we're going to be looking at course success, right? So this is a course success rate for college level courses. So this actually excludes most forms of remedial math and all forms of remedial English. So that we're going to be looking at students who are prepared to take college level coursework. And you can still see here, non-foster youth students have a higher course success rate than foster youth students. You can see in figure 12 there, we can break it down by ethnicity, and we can see those disparities within the foster youth population in community college. And so these disparities might be lower than expected, or the rates might be closer than expected, because we are looking at students who are college level, ready to take college level coursework. And this is not reflective upon students who are taking lots of remedial coursework in their first year in community college. Next slide. So now we're going to be looking at the predictors of that course success rate, right? So this is for first-time foster youth students. We looked at the 12-13 academic cohort, so we can track students going forward. So that's first-time foster youth students in 12-13. And we included in these regression models demographic information like race, gender, high school transcript data, as well as factors like how many high schools they went to. So you can see here on the right hand side, for each additional high school grade point that a foster youth student has, their course success rate goes up by 15.4%, right? So that's to be expected. High school GPA is the greatest indicator for success on when students matriculate into community college. So what was a more novel and interesting finding there on the left is the number of high schools. So for each additional high school that a foster youth student attends, that course success rate declines by 6.4%. Now, in this regression model, race and gender were not significant. So these were the only two significant factors. So once we control for GPA, you can look at just the number of high schools for foster youth students. Now, what's not shown here on the slide is this same analysis for number of number of high schools for non-foster youth students. So that was about -1%. So you can see for foster youth students, it's really impactful the number of high schools, or it negatively impacts the course success rate with each additional high school that they attended. Next slide, please. So these regression models looked at the institutional and program factors that predict completing 30 credit units within the first year in community college. So this data is based off the survey that April mentioned earlier. So this is going to be looking at the 15-16 cohort. We chose that year because it's the closest year to the actual survey, the survey data, which was in 2017. So the model included the factors from the survey, which were things like funding sources, dedicated facilities for foster youth students, support programs, staffing, and as well as the percentage of foster youth students served by various programs on campus. So you can see, so colleges with any form of early alert system had on average 6.8 more foster youth, 6.8% more higher foster youth completing that 30 units in that first academic year. And so colleges with a dedicated computer lab for foster youth students had 6.6 more foster youth, 6.6% more foster youth complete that 30 unit threshold. And so you can see there, for foster youth program utilization, for every 10% increase in foster youth served by a specialized program, the colleges could expect about a 1.5 percentage increase in students who complete that 30 unit threshold. So on the left side there, you see placement reform. So colleges that identified placement initiatives to address remedial placement into the community college had 6.9% fewer foster youth complete the 30 units in that first academic year. So this can be for two reasons. So a lot of schools did not have these reforms in place in 2015, 2016. And also foster youth students may not benefit as much from placement based on high school transcripts, given the fragmented nature of many foster youth K-12 experience. So next slide, please. So this is the decision tree. We're going to be looking at pathways to completion of an award or transfer. So this is going to be we're going to be looking at pathways that students take to complete an associate's degree, a chancellor's office certificate, or transfer to a four-year university. So again, we looked at the 12-13 cohort so that we can track these students forward. And so you can see right there all the way to the left, that orange box there. So foster youth students overall in this cohort were 11% likely to complete, so to achieve one of these awards or transfer. So foster youth students who actually take a math course within their first 2 years, that likelihood jumps up to 16%. So this is not a transfer level math course. This is transfer or remedial math. So if a student takes any type of math between their first 2 years, their likelihood of completion goes up to 16%. And then, so if we keep going up and to the right, you can see that this is the optimal path. Foster youth students who complete any math and English course, any math or English course, within their first 2 years, it goes up to 18%. And then to the right of that, foster youth students who take math, take English in the first 2 years, and declare a goal upon matriculation, that goes up to 19% likely to complete. So when we say declare a goal, that means when a student applies on CCC Apply, they declare a goal, a stated goal of that they want to transfer, get an associate's degree, or get a community college chancellor's office certificate. So you can see all the way, if we go up to into the right, that dark orange, that is the optimal path for foster youth students to complete. And once again, these are all things that students do upon matriculation. So this is not based off their high school performance. These are things that foster youth students can do, and administrators can point foster youth students to do, that are going to help them complete once they step foot on campus. So these are very actionable steps that administrators can help students with. Next slide. So I'm going to point it back to April for the discussion.
Great, thank you, Elliot. So before we move on from this slide, the one thing I do want to add is that we know that it's not possible for everyone to complete the optimal path. You know, sometimes you'll reach a student and they haven't done all of the things, right? They haven't taken math, or they didn't take English. But what this graphic shows in the lighter orange is the second best path, or the best alternative. So if you take math and English, great. But if you only take math, or if you don't take math and declare a goal, your chances of completing are still better. And we like to lay that out because there are many options and pathways forward, and we're hoping that this in particular becomes an actionable path for individuals who are working with foster youth at the community college level. So in terms of discussion, you know, circling back first to the demographics, you know, we've identified, you know, 23, almost 24,000 foster youth who are currently enrolled in the community college system in California. And while we have noted trends in foster youth versus non-foster youth, where there continue to be disparities, a key contribution of this work was identifying disparities within foster youth by race and ethnicity, which had not previously been possible in terms of their educational outcomes in this forum. And so while, you know, almost 20% of foster youth who are enrolled are African American, this group has some of the most challenged outcomes. And so we want to be able to shine a light forward on areas that need attention, but also provide a pathway to potential success for these students. We also talked a little bit about persistence after the first year and the importance of receiving a standard high school diploma, as well as declaring a goal. So again, as people, it's not just about the community college system, but rather the entire K-12 and post-secondary pipeline working together and having the information that they need to support foster youth before they even enroll in community college. And we know that about 85% of foster youth in California who go to college go to community college. So this pathway is particularly important. In addition, in terms of course success, as Elliot pointed out, the number of high schools attended by foster youth really had an influence on their outcomes. And for every additional high school that a foster youth attends, you know, they're having a 6% decrease in their course success rate. So, you know, I know that the Every Student Succeeds Act and other pieces of legislation are focusing on educational stability. And so this is just another piece of evidence and another actionable piece of information for people to know that it's not just the student experience in high school that is important for, but also pays dividends down to the community college level. And finally, looking at the institutional and program practices that are supportive of foster youth student success in that 30 credit completion that we know is so important to later attainment of a degree or certificate. Having a mix of programs, a mix of in particular seem to have positive effects for foster youth. One of those examples was that early alert system. So if a college had an early alert system, that could have been anything from an automated computer system that identified when foster youth, when all students, were meeting some milestones that show that they need some additional support. But we also identified colleges that the foster youth program in particular manually were asking students to bring in progress reports, or in one innovative case, progress reports were brought into a college that provided free childcare to foster youth. So it's tying together a specific concrete support for parenting foster youth with an early alert system. So there's a wide array of what these programs and services may look like. But we do know that the presence of that type of institution-wide or targeted support made a difference. Similarly, having a computer lab and access to dedicated technology facilities was also supportive. In terms of serving a high proportion of foster youth, that is something that had not been previously identified. And we can unpack what that might mean, perhaps, providing supports to a broad range of the foster youth population means that students are not coming into crisis academically or personally and socially before they come to get supports, and maybe that is tied to better outcomes. So we're not saying it is causal, but that was a novel finding just in terms of serving a large group of students. And then in terms of remedial placement reform, this one was a little trickier to unpack because, as we said, we had the most recent year of foster youth data from 2015 to 2016, which was just slightly older than the 2017 survey of when program and practices were in place. So we know many colleges may have been exploring multiple measures of placement and other remedial placement reforms that have shown benefit, a huge benefit to some disadvantaged populations, particularly racial and ethnic minority students. However, it might be that foster youth are not able to take advantage of multiple measures and other placement reforms in that way because they may have a fragmented high school transcript, or their transcript might not be reflective of their capacity to succeed. Alternately, it is entirely possible that many of the colleges who identified the need for remedial placement reforms had not yet implemented them. So it's more a marker of a need to change something. So moving on briefly to limitations, we mentioned these foster youth that were identified by the college. This was all done by self-report, financial aid applications. So it is possible that we are missing some foster youth, or that foster youth may have been identified in error by their college. We also note that the analyses don't control for the length or intensity of a student's stay in foster care. And so it could be that some students may have had an extended stay and aged out of care, and others might have been, in care for a comparatively brief period, to say nothing of the experiences that brought them to foster care and what that might have in terms of the impact that might have in terms of their educational outcomes. The report does not evaluate the causal relationship between specific foster youth programs and student outcomes. And this is important because some of the pieces that were raised in the survey and that we looked at as an initial exploratory step in that regression that looked at foster youth outcomes by institutional and program practices, we might not have had enough colleges respond to that, endorse having a specific program or a specific support, whether facility or peer support or something like that, to identify that as a significant finding. So very initial stages, and we are not implying causality at all. And then finally, while this report was a big step forward in terms of having all 114 community colleges in California, it does not, may not be generalizable to other states. So finally, looking at next steps, given the increasingly visible importance, especially in our analysis of the high school experience of foster youth. We are seeking to do a great deal of data matching and analysis that links K-12 school districts and community colleges, so we can understand the whole span of a foster youth career, educational career. We also would like to cross-reference community college and child welfare data to understand some of those pieces around length of time in care, placement stability, and ensure that we are correctly identifying foster youth as foster youth. A deeper analysis of institutional and program factors is needed with a larger sample of colleges. While we had slightly more than half of the colleges respond, I think there are more targeted questions to ask and be administered to a larger group. I also believe it's incredibly important to hear directly from foster youth to identify what is working, things, resources or supports that they have found helpful, whether or not we have thought to ask the questions yet. And then analyzing the fourth E. We have not included embark on a career in our report and analysis, as we're waiting for enough time to lapse to illuminate the connection between post-secondary education and the labor market and later economic well-being. We do know it's incredibly important for all students, but particularly for foster youth to succeed. So I'm going to turn it over to Debbie.
Great. Thank you so much to both of you, April and Elliot. For those of you listening, thank you to those of you who have been sending in questions. We're going to get to that in just 1 minute. If you haven't had a chance to send in your question yet, it's not too late. You can go ahead and type any question that you might have into the question panel, and I will put these questions to Elliot and April in just a minute. But before we transition to that, we have one last slide that I wanted to talk about, which are the policy implications of this research. You know, we're big fans of not doing research just for the sake of doing research, but actually using the research to really inform and understand how we can improve outcomes for foster youth. And so some of the key takeaways for me as a policy advocate from reading this research, the first is that new strategies for reducing placement instability and school mobility are needed. You know, this is one of the first times we've really had research that's directly linked school mobility and how many times a foster youth gets moved around to different schools with decreased likelihood to be successful in post-secondary education. So that's very clearly an issue that we need to continue to think about how to address. Ensuring that foster youth are receiving proper guidance in high school regarding graduation options, college matriculation, and educational planning is key. April and Elliot talked a lot about the various things that can happen before somebody even enters college in terms of whether they get a high school diploma versus a GED, whether they declare a goal, the classes that they choose to register in, and so making sure that that all foster youth have this information as early as possible is really important. Access to adequate financial aid so that students can enroll in as many units as possible is essential. And finally, continuing to invest in supporting for foster youth who are attending community college. This is also one of the first times we've had some evidence that really points to the correlation between college support programs for foster youth and successful outcomes. Next slide. So before we go to Q&A, just wanted to give everybody a heads up on the next web seminar we're going to be doing at JBay, which is a webinar about our FAFSA challenge. We're doing a FAFSA challenge this year, trying to get all of our high school seniors who are in foster care to have FAFSAs completed before they exit high school. And so that's Friday, November 17th. The link is there on your screen. Again, you can download the presentation as well from you can refer them to Elliot as needed based on your division of labor.
Okay, that sounds great.
So we will start.
Happy to always put Elliot on the spot.
Exactly. So the first question we got was a question about, for the higher rates of taking remedial math or English that your study found, any thoughts on whether this is due to foster youth being less prepared for college, or more vigilant assessment or attention to foster youth to make sure they're getting the services they need?
Mm-hmm. So initially, a whole body of our work here at ERP has focused on how placement exams that are used often in isolation, standalone placement exams, that place students into remedial coursework are not a great predictor of student success. This is now going to be spread across all community college campuses with AB 705. Now, when I think about that, particularly for foster youth, I think it might be a combination of the two things. It's definitely an area that needs some further work and some research, and something that I am really interested in diving into. If foster youth do not succeed well on the remedial placement test, on the course placement test, that is not something that is unique to them. We've seen overrepresentation of students of color on this as well. But I also think that foster youth have had often a very fragmented high school experience, just in terms of the number of schools attended. When school transitions happen in high school for youth, it's not happening at the end of the quarter or the end of a semester, but in the middle of the night. And so just as their experience as a learner, that might be a place that we want to explore models like co-requisites or accelerated pathways that students can master any information that they might have missed and quickly move on to college level coursework rather than being placed into remedial courses.
Great. So next question is just a clarifying question. One of the slides referenced likelihood to persist, and they just wanted to understand, does that mean that only 49% of foster youth decide to continue after each semester, meaning 51% choose to abandon college?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to let Elliot take that. Go ahead.
Yes, I'll take that. So when we looked at this particular cohort, it was just tracking the first semester for students entering the community college system. So when we say likelihood to persist, it didn't mean students that started either in the summer or the fall of that particular year and persisted to that, for quarter schools, persisted to that winter, or for semester schools just to that spring. So it's just looking at the student's first term to their second term. So it could be that a student maybe at let's say a quarter school was validly enrolled in at least one course in the fall, didn't take in the winter, but then took classes in the spring. That student would still be counted as not persisting because they didn't go from that first to that second term. So that 49% that's how we define it for this analysis.
Great, thank you.
I think if I can just add one more piece there,
yeah.
That's taking a single course. And so given the low number of credits that a foster youth might be taking, we'd love to see if that is that students took a pause, or if they were already, they went from taking a large number of credits to nothing the next semester, because I think those two things are very different. So definitely an area of follow-up.
Great, thank you. So I think this question is probably for Elliot. Correct me if I'm wrong. The question is, what was the sample size for the data?
So for the 12, 13,
I'll let Elliot share.
For the 12, 13 cohorts that we were tracking forward, so the initial cohort of foster youth students was about 4,000. But what we did to incorporate the high school data, we actually only looked at students who we had 4 years of data for in the CalPAS Plus system, because we wanted to accurately, we wanted to make sure we had all the students' data so we can accurately report the GPA and the number of schools that they went to. So the number of foster youth students was about 4,000. In this analysis that we used for the decision trees, it was about 700 students that we had 4 years of data for those analysis. So that was the sample size for the decision trees.
And we actually, in the technical appendix to the report, provide a detailed demographic breakdown for the larger descriptive analyses, as well as the 600 plus, almost 700 students who are included in the decision tree analysis. That detailed breakdown shows that the 600 students were largely reflective of that larger 4,000 foster youth student population. We know that it may slightly bias results to only include students that had all 4 years of data. So that is a limitation to that research as well.
Great. And that actually reminds me, up on your screen, everybody can see the link to read the full reports. So, this, April and Elliot just gave you kind of the broad strokes. There's a lot more really interesting information. You can read the decision trees and kind of spend a little more time studying that, read the technical appendix. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at the full report. The next question is, have you ever considered doing a study like this in Southern California? We're sort of looking at geographic differences perhaps between outcomes.
So it's definitely possible with our system of data. We can replicate this for any, regional or sub-regional level. The other thing that we would like to do, I mentioned this high school data. LAUSD and some additional high school districts are exploring or have already shared high school level data. And so that might be the way into us doing some of this more regional analysis because the demographics of any one college might be different.
Great. So the next question, I think, Elliot, you're going to take this one. Regarding the outcomes for students taking English and math within the first 2 years, do you know anything about how this applies specifically to CTE students?
So that's a good question. So in this report, we don't disaggregate between CTE and non-CTE students. In some at ERP and some of our previous research, we've actually looked at particularly foster youth CTE students, students who've taken 9 or more CTE units, and one of those courses having an advanced SAM code. So we've done research looking at the likelihood of success for these foster youth students in CTE, but actually in this analysis, in this report, we didn't disaggregate. But so as far as taking the English and math courses, as April highlighted, kind of the optimal. So we have that's the optimal path, but we also have the other paths where, say, a student doesn't take English or math, and we can look at students declaring a goal. So if a student declares a goal of gaining a chancellor's office award, that'll coincide with the CTE education. So if a student doesn't take English or math or a combination of those two courses, we can still see the likelihood for students who declared a particular goal.
Great, thanks. So there's a question about the counterintuitive finding about why colleges with initiatives to address remedial placement showed a negative impact on 30 credit completion. So I think you talked about this a little bit, but maybe if you want to say a little more about maybe how some of either the study limitations may have impacted that or other. Sure. I know this will all be purely speculative, but your thoughts on that question.
Yes, I'm happy to speculate. So just a little bit of orientation for how our approach here at EdResults to multiple measures has worked. And Elliot, please feel free to chime in because he and our data scientists do a great deal of work in partnership with CalPAS Plus to make this happen. But what we do is look at specific transcript level indicators of a student before, up through their high school career, and identify pieces that are predictive of student success. So that is specific courses that are taken, course sequences and grades in those courses. And so if a foster youth student is trying to benefit from those models the way that non-foster youth students do, there may be certain things that don't allow them to benefit from that in the same way. For example, if you haven't taken a specific algebra course that we are looking for a grade in to support placement based on that, well, or you weren't able to because you changed schools and that class section was full and you ended up in a different course, you're not going to be able to be placed on multiple measures in that same way. So that's just how it might work on a speculative basis. And then strictly by limitations, as we mentioned, the survey was done fairly recently in 2017, and the most recent year of student data that we had at that point was from 2015, 2016. So multiple measures and other placement reforms have really been ramping up in the most recent year. And the survey question as asked, because we were just kind of exploring it initially, was around if places had explored and or implemented. So often, and based on the data that we have access to in terms of who is implementing multiple measures and other placement reforms, the vast majority of the colleges had not yet implemented at the time that our data was pulled in terms of the quantitative CalPAS Plus data. But if it's something that I definitely want to follow forward into the 2017 data and see if that is still an active finding. So definitely something to keep the eye on.
Yeah, and there's another question that came in about whether schools are examining their multiple measures and alternative placement mechanisms and whether foster youth are more vulnerable. And I think that one of the things that came out of this research study is really shining a light on that question and bringing it to our attention as something that we need to really keep an eye on. I don't think we have a definitive answer to that yet. But it's very clear that as multiple measures does roll out at more institutions, that keeping an eye on that data and seeing whether there's any difference in how it impacts foster youth specifically is going to be really essential.
Well, we've seen this in other groups that are not able to benefit from the standard models maybe in the same way. So returning learners who don't have recent high school transcript data, might face some of the same barriers. And so it's an area that we are, at EdResults, we say that we're data informed, equity focused, and employer led, because we are looking towards students achieving a living wage career and a stackable career ladder. And so this is something that, in terms of equity, it needs attention, and we are definitely going to follow it going forward.
Great. So we have one final question here, and I'm going to, I think, offer a little context for this question. So the question is, how does the credit waiver and the reduction in math and English impact a youth's success during the first year of college? And I believe what the questioner is referring to is the state law that allows for foster youth to waive certain local graduation requirements in certain circumstances. And I won't go into the details, but sometimes foster youth, because of these exceptions in the law, don't necessarily end up taking the same level of math and English that might be locally required within that district. And so, again, I'm pretty sure there's no research on the impact of that law on college success, but if you have any thoughts on that question and what kind of future research it might implicate.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. And, we were able to share a little bit of this work at the Blueprint for Success conference, and doing a plug for Debbie and how wonderful that conference was. And we had that same question come up. And so what we are aware of, first of all, it came up also in the context of, are you looking at the different types of standard high school diplomas? Are you differentiating, as well as looking at the types of courses students might have taken? And our initial answer was, no, not yet. We do in CalPAS Plus have that transcript level data. So insofar as information is there are questions that we are, very interested in mining going forward. And, our research is not here to say, if you don't have a standard high school diploma, or if you didn't, if you did the credit waiver, specific, policy option, that you can't succeed. Quite the opposite. Rather, we're saying we want to shine light on pathways to success. And so a next step might be for students who, were able to take advantage of, the credit waiver, what are your pathways to success? And sample size permitting, and data quality being what it is, it's something that's definitely worth investigating, since that's something that foster youth may be availing themselves of more than other population groups.
So we have 30 seconds, and I just got a last-minute question, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it really quickly. Did you look at parenting status and any association with success there, and the role that child care supports or family housing might play?
We did not look at. Go ahead, Elliot.
We did not. So in the data set that we get from the Chancellor's Office, that field in particular and some other supportive fields aren't populated as well, but continually going forward, they will be populated better. So then that'll be another powerful indicator that we can use in our models.
And I was going to add, on the survey side, we did ask about, different various support programs. So that's something that we'll also follow up at the institution level so that we understand both the needs and the supports that are in place.
Great. Well, I want to just say a big thank you to April and Elliot, not only for today's webinar, but for the amazing research and all the hard work that you put into this report. Again, we'll be sending all of this out to those of you who registered for the webinar. And that ends today's webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.